Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law. As Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's war of choice against Iran continues to unfold, I've asked the Gulf expert Andreas Krieg onto the podcast to help us try and make sense of this conflict that threatens to engulf the Middle East and has global implications that those who started it seem to have given little or no consideration to. Andreas, good to have you back on the podcast in these very difficult times.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Um, as the defense and security specialist, what do you make of the U.S. and Israeli management of the war thus far?
It's a complete mess. It's a complete mess from the American point of view. I don't think there is a clear strategy. Every day we hear a different version of what the objectives are from different members of the administration. Some of them say it's about regime change. Others are saying it's a very short intervention to degrade the missile capabilities. Now there are suggestions that they might arm local forces on the ground to actually take the regime out. Some are saying it's going to take a couple of weeks, some of them a couple of days, some of them saying it's a forever war. I mean, Trump yesterday was tweeting that, we have stockpiles that last forever. It's very, very confusing. I think the only ones who are really in the driver's seat right now and are dictating the terms, strategically at least, are the Israelis. The Iranians have regained a little bit of momentum as well, so they're able to kind of dictate the level and pace of escalation through their all-out spraying over the Gulf with missiles. Thereby, they have retained some control over events on the ground. I think the Americans are being driven by a variety of different events. They obviously have no control over what Iran is doing towards the Gulf states. They can't really control the Gulf states. They can't really protect the Gulf states. Equally, they didn't seem to be able to contain the Israeli need to go first. This Netanyahu's hyperactivism to get sucked into this war, and now they're trying to find reasons for why they went in the war at this point in time. None of the reasons add up. All the congressmen who were and lawmakers who were invited to that briefing yesterday didn't come out with more clarity. They actually left that meeting, this intelligence brief, with more questions actually and more uncertainty. And so I think strategically is a complete mess.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting too, isn't it, Andreas, that there were no plans in place to get American citizens out of the war zones, and it was only, I think, yesterday or the day before they actually put out advice from the State Department. Again, a measure of the inadequacy or the lack of preparation, I suppose, built on the assumption somehow that this is going to be a quick war and it'll all be over in a couple of days. But look, I want to
Yeah.
ask you too about Iran and how they're managing the war. But before I do, I think it'd be really helpful for our listeners if you could shed some light on the military structures in Iran and how they function. Because on the one hand, you have the army, you have the Artesh, and then on the other side, you have the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So who is calling the shots, Andreas?
Nobody's calling the shots. So we have to think about Iran as being structured very similar to some of the insurgency groups and non-state actors that Iran is supporting, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Houthis, which is a networked approach. They are built to last, they're built to resist, they have an inbuilt sort of degree of resilience where there isn't a centralized command and control system. So all militaries usually are built around a central core of command and control that is usually quite hierarchical. It's stratified. It's based on rank, where decisions are made on the top and then they kind of trickle down to the bottom, where there are degrees of what we call mission command, where local or tactical commanders can take initiative, but essentially everything is really set out from the core or from the top. That's not the case with the war footing in the war footing that Iran is in now, which is mosaic defense, where they're trying to delegate activity to the local level, where initiative is on the local level, without having to clear certain targets, certain activity with the core or with higher ranking commanders. And that is a very different setup from a regular military. And that has to do with the fact that obviously we do have two parallel security sectors. As you mentioned, you have the Artesh, which is the kind of regular hierarchical military, but then you have the IRGC that controls all the levers of deterrence, including the missile program, drone program, and also whatever is left of the nuclear program. And so the IRGC is organized in a much more network, decentralized way than any other normal military. And they're the ones who call the shots. But the shots are not being called centrally by a single command structure or by a single commander, but are called but are probably divided into dozens of different local command structures that take decisions or basically take decisions and initiative as they see fit, following a sort of vague directive. So you have a centralized intent, and that centralized intent in many ways is set on the strategic level, was set before the war broke out, with a somewhat vague vision of what it is that they're trying to achieve, which is trying to disrupt trade and trade flows and energy flows from the Gulf to the rest of the world, trying to inflict as much pain as possible on the Gulf states to make them lobby Trump to stop this war or keep this war short. And so that's kind of where we're at the moment, where you have a decentralized system with a very vague strategic intent, and then initiative being taken on the local level. On top of that, this entire network structure, because essentially Iran is a network state, is being further exacerbated by the fact that they're delegating now to some of their other networked non-state actors, such as Kataib, Hezbollah, and armed non-state actors in southern Iraq. The Houthis so far have been quiet, but Hezbollah has also chipped in. So this is a very, very problematic thing for a regular military such as Israel or the United States to deal with, because there isn't a single decapitation strike that you can take against it. What you can do is degrade, but degradation is very complex because it's also geographically diffused and non-concentrated. And militaries, usually what they try to do in our modern thinking is trying to concentrate force at a single center of gravity, degrade it, and thereby try to win the war. Iran at the moment doesn't have a single center of gravity, and that makes this war now a war of attrition, which I think the Iranians are much better prepared to outlast.
Yeah, and the fact that very senior people in the IRGC and in the army have been taken out, that doesn't cause the sort of damage that the Americans and the Israelis anticipated.
Certainly is a damage. I think we'll have to see to what extent the network decentralized approach lasts and to what extent they are able to sustain it. It's geared towards survival. It's not geared towards, offensive, proactive, sort of proactively winning a war. But my point would be that all Iran needs to do to win is survive. And what Israel and America has to do is clearly showing that they have a strategic objective that they're able to fulfill and achieve. And that is going to be extremely difficult because if Trump now pulls out prematurely and says, mission accomplished, he will be tested on whether he actually achieved these objectives. And so far, it's debatable. Degradation in itself is not a strategic endgame, and it's something that's been thrown around by the Trump administration. And so it would be very difficult for him to say we won. I think for an insurgency actor or an actor that is networked and built up in a network structure like Iran, it's much easier to just say we survived this, we're still here, and hence we won the war. But degradation obviously will have an impact, but it means you'll have to go wave after wave. So yesterday we had an attempt by the Israelis to kill the next layer, next level of leadership in Iran. I think they didn't succeed, but it shows that that's basically what the Israelis are trying to do, is trying to kill every single leader that's been announced, wave after wave. The problem with a decentralized approach then is that you have a fairly chaotic system, because initiative means there is at least maybe 60 different command centers kind of taking their own decisions, striking targets as they see fit. And even if you're trying to negotiate with the core, because essentially, let's be truthful, you're only going to clear and finish this war through a negotiated settlement eventually. That means you need to speak to someone on the other side. Qatar and Oman, as the key mediators here, need to speak to someone on the other side. You need to have someone there. And then you also need to be able, for this individual needs to be able to then translate whatever's being negotiated to the local level. And if you have that decentralized structure, this will be extremely, extremely difficult.
Mm. Okay, let's look now at how Iran is conducting this war. And you've touched on this already, the attacks on the GCC states. And I'm wondering, Andreas, is that a smart strategy? Or is it one that could swing those states into the Israel-US military orbit?
I think it's probably it is not probably, definitely going to be a pivotal moment in the Gulf's history. That's the worst crisis the Gulf states have endured in its history. And it also they're clearly seeing that, the region was thrown into this chaos by Israel ultimately. But equally, they're saying that they're being now targeted primarily by Iran. And that kind of brings back an old phobia in the Gulf over Iran and Iran being the greatest threat. After Israel's attack on Qatar last year, and I think I said it, for most Gulf states, suddenly it was clear Israel is the greatest threat to regional stability. And now Iran was always number two, and there's always, it's either Israel or Iran. It's quite clear now that Iran is right on the top of the list again. And I think this will be a lasting damaging impact on Gulf-Iran relations. Equally, the Gulf states know geographics are not going to change. Iran is not going to go anywhere, so they'll have to maintain that relationship. But it is a slippery slope because, on the one hand, they have to respond. They can't just sustain this fire. They can't just say, okay, we'll take another hit. They also have a fear of depleting eventually their air defense system, so they have to push out defense as far away from urban centers as possible, going as much as they can into forward defense. And that is a slippery slope because the further away you go from urban centers, the closer you get to Iranian airspace, the closer you attack launchers from at source, the more likely going to strike targets inside Iran. And that is the sort of slippery slope where you end up eventually, striking Iran. And that makes you, kind of gets you sucked into a war. But at the same time, all the Gulf states still are very clear that they don't want to be part of this destructive, reckless, Israeli-made and Israeli-dictated war. And so they'll have to find their own way. And they're quite clear that everything they're doing right now, their posture is defensive. It's not offensive. Even if they were to strike launches inside Iran, that's not the Gulf states getting offensively involved against Iran. That's not in their intent. But you certainly see that the Iranian activities now and their actions have really driven a massive wedge in bilateral relations in the Gulf. And that is not something the Gulf states will just gloss over in a few months' time and forget about it. And so the Iranians must be aware of that. I also think it's a massive miscalculation to think that you are bombing the peacemakers, you're bombing the mediators like Oman and Qatar in particular, who've been calling for peace, have been mediating on your behalf with the Americans, and you're trying to bomb them to pressure them to be stronger peacemakers. I mean, it's an absurd, paradoxical approach to diplomacy and statecraft.
Yeah, and it does it come back to, Andreas, to this decentralized and somewhat debased structure that people are making up their minds independently, and there's a lack of cohesive oversight.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've seen the foreign minister of Iran saying we didn't strike Saudi Arabia. He said we didn't strike Oman. But then obviously there were drones that came and, that did hit Oman in Salalah and Duqm. There are projectiles that flew onto Saudi, possibly from Iraq, not from Iran. But my point being is it's quite clear that the Iranian foreign minister doesn't know what's going on. It's clear that the government of Iran doesn't have control over activities on the local level.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the security and defense analyst, Andreas Krieg. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Sign up, and you'll receive the first 2 months free. That's arabdigest.org. Okay, now, Trump boasting yesterday once again that they've killed all these people, and the people I wanted to talk to, they've been killed, and of course there was this attack on the efforts to select a new leader. The Israelis claiming that they had accomplished what they set out to do on that front. But this idea that you're lopping off the head of the snake, in this case, I suppose a hydra, many-headed snake, I look at that, and I think you'd agree with me, it's facile and superficial and I think profoundly dangerous. Do you think that is the case, Andreas?
It's called the Hydra effect. If you go back to Greek mythology, that you chop one head off and then two heads grow back. That's the kind of problem that the US and Israel are facing. In the same way, that's the problem they were facing with Hamas and Hezbollah. Mind you, their decapitation strategy since 2023 has not really brought about strategic victory against Hamas or Hezbollah. These networks are still alive and they're still kicking. And Iran has to be seen in the same light. Even if more chaos was to unravel within Iran, and we'll see splits within elites, and we might see some of secessionist groups being armed and taking and mobilizing against the regime. If all that was going to happen, even then, the core of what makes the IRGC system essentially is unlikely going to just collapse. And so decapitation in this context does not exist. There is no such thing as a decapitation. A network cannot be decapitated. And I've said it many times vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah, and I'm saying it again when it comes to Iran. Nodes can be replaced and bypassed. And that certainly is the case when you look at the defense network that the Israelis and the Americans are up against. So it's a Sisyphonian sort of approach where you keep on trying to chop heads off and they grow back. That in itself is not strategy. That is a war of attrition. And that war of attrition, again, is a war for time, and one that I think the Iranians are better prepared to endure indefinitely, more so than the Americans.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, bear in mind, too, that the Iranians fought an 8-year war with the Iraqis. They've sustained and managed the sanctions through decades now, really. And this is a very resilient country in terms of the challenges.
Well, the caveat to this would be, though, the Islamic Republic was fairly popular in 1970, 1980, when the Iraq-Iran war happened. So it was easier for them to mobilize people. It was easier to generate a buy-in. I think now the Islamic Republic is at its absolute low point. The regime is in terms of popular support inside Iran. And that means it will be more difficult for them to sustain an effort like this and mobilize people on their behalf. I would say that probably 70% of the people across all spectrums, ethnic groups, and all parts of society oppose the Islamic Republic and the regime. That doesn't mean, though, they're necessarily all going to work for Israel. And that's the other problem, that the Israelis just think just because they don't like the Islamic Republic, that they will then like to fly the banner of Israel and fight Israel's war against Iran. That's also not going to happen. The Persians, the Iranians are extremely nationalistic and proud and patriotic people. They're also not going to let that happen. Plus, what most Iranians want is a multi-ethnic nation state. They don't want one over the other. And this is the other problem of the Trump approach. So they're trying to exploit and play with the internal dynamics of Iran, these sort of these friction points and fault lines that have come up, which are mostly social-political grievances, socio-economic grievances. And by now saying or putting it out there that they're trying to arm the Kurds and potentially work with the Baluchistan separatists, that is just a recipe for absolute quagmire and chaos.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's look now at the UK and Prime Minister Starmer's handling of the situation, which I look at it and I think it's a confused message. We have learned the lesson of Iraq, he says, so no repeat of 2003, but we're going to assist the U.S., presumably Israel and our allies in the Gulf, with defensive measures. I'm perplexed about how, if you let the Americans use your bases, you're going to know they're using it for defensive or offensive purposes. But putting that aside, is there a danger that the Prime Minister is slow walking the UK into another Iraq?
I don't think so, actually. It's quite clear where we're coming from. We have no capacity, we have no bandwidth for a major war. We are overstretched as it is. Our focus, 90% of our capacity in the civil service, across the military spectrum is Russia and Ukraine. We don't have any spare capacity to do anything in that region, so certainly not offensively. But what we can do is we can obviously, number one is we're sending a a Royal Navy ship into the Eastern Mediterranean. That is a protective measure to defend sovereign British territory in Cyprus. We have a joint squadron with the Qatari Air Force in Qatar. This squadron has been already involved in defensive measures, has already taken out projectiles and drones coming from Iran, so they're already part of that defensive operation. And that's part of the Defence Cooperation Agreement between Qatar and the UK. All of that is business as usual. What is a little bit of a slippery slope, again, going back to what I said earlier about forward defense, depends on how forward you're pushing the defense. If you're now willing to strike projectiles when launched in Iranian airspace or on the ground in Iran, even if you launch the ordnance from Qatari airspace, you're still hitting Iran in Iranian airspace. That is a bit of a slippery slope. But, this is a war that the UK hasn't chosen. It was a Hezbollah missile that hit a sovereign UK base. And so we have all right to respond to that. But there is certainly no appetite anywhere in London to get part of it, become part of this war. And I do have to say, with all the problems that we had in this government about how their posture was vis-a-vis the war in Gaza, I do think they've now taken the right approach in terms of saying we're there to defend our partners and allies. After all, gas exports, energy exports from the Gulf is a key national strategic interest. We have to defend that. That's part of who we are. That's part of our national security strategy. But also, we made it very clear that we do not become complicit in what is an Israeli-American initiative. We objected to it. We didn't allow bases to be used offensively. Now we're saying we are allowing it for defensive measures. I agree with you. That is, again, slippery slope. There's no way we can control what the Americans are doing with these bases. But I think that's, policy in the end of the day is always suboptimal. So you have to try to weigh two suboptimal courses of action. And I think the government now, this time around, has taken the right approach.
Okay. Now, it's often said, Andreas, it's easy to launch a war and very hard to get out of one. The exit strategy, or if there's no apparent exit strategy, an exit ramp. Do you see either in Trump's management of this war?
I don't think we have an entry strategy, let alone an exit strategy. The problem with wars usually is we're relatively good at planning for how to win the war. Get it to a situation where you can then close the war. The problem that we usually have is the sort of post-bellum, the after-war peace building stabilization. That's where we struggle. That's where we probably have failed most of the time. But in this war, we don't even have an entry strategy. We don't even have a strategy of what it is that we want to achieve. We don't even know how victory looks like. Essentially, what you need is some sort of narrative, a victory narrative, a story of success. We don't have a story of success in this war. And that's the problem. Obviously, nobody's even thinking about down the line of what this could mean. In the best case scenario, we will have a realization in Washington that nothing more can be achieved from the air, that we don't want to get sucked into a lengthy war of regime change by surrogate, because nobody wants really, a surrogate war would be terrible. And that they're trying to find a diplomatic off-ramp. But the Iranians at the moment are the ones who don't want to talk. They're the ones who are rejecting various offers made by the Americans and interlocutors because they think they still have to give the Americans a bit of a bloody nose. So there is also egos involved in that. And every day that there is more escalation, the more unlikely it becomes for this to be a quick war. And the narrative now in Washington is that the administration is spreading, is saying this is going to be a longer war. For me, 4 weeks is an extremely long war. I think there will be some problems down the line. I think after 10 days, 2 weeks, the armada that Trump has assembled will run out of steam and certainly run out of ordnance at some point if the intensity remains as it is now. So you have then two choices. You're either try to seek a diplomatic off-ramp and call it mission accomplished and then try to get a deal out of it. Very difficult because the Iranians have to agree to it. Or you're saying, okay, we'll just make it a little bit like Israel in Lebanon. We strike from time to time, but we leave it as it is, and we punish them from time to time, but we're not actually seeking an effective off-ramp. That means you're basically stuck in a low intensity forever war. And the problem of that is obviously as long as Iran is being attacked, they will start throwing or continue throwing missiles and drones, certainly drones because they have a lot of them, at the Gulf states. And it doesn't need to cause major damage in the Gulf. All it needs to do is basically disrupt services, disrupt flight path and freedom of navigation. That in itself is enough to kind of disrupt the ordinary pattern of life in the Gulf. So that is certainly not that wouldn't be a great outcome. And in the worst case scenario, that Trump might think, oh, there is a surrogate off-ramp here. We'll just arm the Kurds, some of the minority groups, and we're going to win this war this way, even if it takes a year or two or three, because we can sustain it because the burden of war will be on the boots on the ground, which are local groups. There isn't obviously a single opposition group that is coherent enough, strong enough to take on this regime. And if you're trying to, play with civil war in Iran to destabilize the regime from inside, you're looking at years, potentially decade or longer of a slow burning, very, very messy regime change war that will have ripple effects across the region, will affect obviously Iraq, Turkey, the Gulf states, Pakistan, and all the other states around, and would be the sort of nightmare quagmire that Trump has promised us he wouldn't get the world involved because he was always running on the ticket of being the peace president.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Shades of Afghanistan there. Um, in that scenario you just
Yes.
painted, and that is a terrible thought, given the outcome of that particular war. But in terms of end strategy, there are those that argue that Netanyahu, he's playing Trump, and he does have an end strategy, which is, as he puts it, reshaping the Middle East, destroying the axis of evil, looking at how he can somehow force Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, working with the United Arab Emirates. He has a vision. Now, one can say this is a mad vision because it just takes us into a region that will succumb to chaos. It will lead to not just disaster in the region, but the ripples, the waves throughout the global economy will be profound. Is that the scenario potentially we could be heading towards, Andreas?
This is why I said early on, there is no strategy in America, but there is a strategy in Israel. And that strategy is chaos. So if your strategy is chaos, you don't have to build anything. Israel has rarely ever built anything. The only thing that they've built is their settlements and their own sort of little entity. They've never cared to build anything in terms of stability anywhere else outside of its borders, and they don't care. They have a very clear strategic culture of trying to sow discord and chaos across their neighboring countries in order to internally destabilize them and keep them away from their borders. That's been Israel's doing for the last 80 years. They've done it in Lebanon. They're trying to do it in Syria. They're now trying to do it in Iran as well. They potentially were looking to do the same now in Somalia and in Yemen. So this is part of their policy. So leaving, kind of decaying and degrading the regime in Iran in itself is a strategic outcome for Israel. As long as Israel retains a clear pathway to strike whenever they want with impunity because Iran cannot defend itself. That is a great outcome. That's a Lebanon type scenario that the Israelis are after in Iran. So I think he has a clear strategy. He seems to be able to get what he wants because he clearly has lobbied hard, and his pro-Israel networks have been lobbying very hard in Washington to get America to this point, and they've fool to do it. And unfortunately, Trump is that fool. I don't think Biden, with all his flaws, would have agreed to this at this point. But they found a fool like Trump who feels like he can do it. He's been emboldened by a yes man around him, of which, most people are reality stars, TV stars who know nothing about statecraft or warfare. I mean, it's a clown show, essentially. And so Netanyahu has found a way to play them. Despite the fact that they all ran on a ticket of America first, they've now become, again, an administration that does Israeli first policy. And Israeli first means chaos in the region. And that even, I think, from an Abu Dhabi point of view, is not what the Emirates want. That's certainly not what the Emirates want. But I don't see this pathway to stability in Iran that Netanyahu is propagating. What he is propagating now is a very thin ideological sort of narrative of saying, people will rise up and they will embrace freedom and we'll have a democracy. We've heard this in 2003 in Iraq. And so it was never deliverable. It's certainly not deliverable now with that fairly thin veneer of capacity and capability in the region. The US doesn't have a stomach or the money to actually do what we did in Iraq, and it still failed. So, no, I think Israel is quite happy with that outcome. The rest of the world isn't.
Yeah. What is your sense of it? Are we heading into never-ending war?
I hope not. Never ending war. I mean, eternity is a very long time. But It certainly looks like the idea of this being a fairly short part of coercive diplomacy, that was never going to work anyway. I mean, all analysts were saying you can't coerce the Iranians through military strikes at this point, after they made all the offers already. I mean, the deal, the framework was on the table. The Omani foreign minister said it last week. He said, we're very close to this deal. Don't upend it. Don't undermine it. And that's exactly what this war has done. So to say that there is an easy pathway back to diplomacy, I think that's an illusion. So we are in it for longer than we expected, but that could be anywhere from 10 days to 4 weeks. In the worst case scenario, it could be a protracted conflict that, the Americans and the Israelis decide to leave simmering, and that could obviously last months. That'd be horrible for the Gulf. But, I still have a hope that we could come to some sort of conclusion in the next, week or so.
Okay, well, let us hope that hope is realized. And I thank you, Andreas, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the defense and security analyst, Andreas Krieg. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. We are following the war and other developments in the Arab world with analysis and commentary from a team of Middle East experts you will not find anywhere else. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.